Oh,
Hey guys, figured I'd make a video on the differences between DRZ400, KLX250, CRF250L, and WR250R. These bikes have been in competition with each other for a very long time, and I figured since I'm in the unique position of having extensive seat time on them, I'd share my thoughts and opinions and maybe give my recommendations on what might suit your riding style best. Hopefully this will give you guys just another resource to pick information for if maybe you're interested in buying one of these bikes, for instance. I hope that I can help, and thank you for watching. First off, I'll give you a little background information on me and my experience with these bikes. I'm just an average Joe with about 3 to 4 years of dirt riding experience. No MX riding, just trail riding, single track, road riding, just a mix of everything, really just dual sport riding. I'm by no means an expert, but I feel confident enough in my abilities to categorize these bikes and vocalize my opinion on them. I'm also 6'7" at about 280 pounds, so these bikes are really put to the test suspension and chassis wise with me on them. Not only that, but my ogreish figure makes me perfect candidate for talking about the ergonomics of these bikes. And really, ergonomics is something I don't hear a lot of reviewers talking about a lot, which I'm not exactly sure why. So I'll try and be as extensive as possible on that subject. Especially for taller riders, this information is extremely useful. I've had to ride a lot of different bikes to understand what fit me best, so hopefully I can help you guys out in this way at least. Now on to the nitty gritty. I used to own a DRZ400. I had it for a little under 2 years, and I put about 3,000 miles on it. I currently own a WR250R. I put about 1,000 miles on it so far, but I've had a lot of experience with them in the past too. My buddy Wyatt also used to own a CRF250L. Whenever I'd go down to my parents', which is about a 3 hour drive from me, he would let me borrow that to ride with my old riding buddies back there. So, I mean, they would save me a bunch on gas not having to haul my bike down there. So that was pretty cool of them. So I have a lot of seat time on that. And then one of my current riding buddies, who now owns a WR250R, used to own a KLX250. It's what he started dual sporting on. He let me ride it a few times. It's I don't have the most extensive amount of seat time on this bike, but I've spent countless hours watching him flog it. He just completely submerged it in water at one point, and we just rode out of there. And I mean, he's put it through a lot of abuse, and I watched him do it. So I can say with confidence that I really know what this bike is capable of. Now I'm going to try and split this video into two main sections. The first section I'm just going to talk about really just the strengths and weaknesses of each bike individually. And then the second section I will give my recommendation on what bike might suit your riding style best. I'll try my hardest to include as many use cases as possible, but I'm sure there's going to be a portion of you guys that I'm going to miss here. So maybe, I guess if you have any questions about it, just respond in the comments below. I'll try and get back to each and every one of you if you have questions. Now, let's dig in and start with the KLX250S. Now, don't get me wrong, the KLX is an awesome bike, and it's priced relatively the same as the CRF250L, therefore it's a bargain, but I just wasn't super impressed with the bike in any particular way. The seating position is a lot more spacious vertically than the 250L, but it's by far the most narrow bike in this lineup. It's easy to flick around on and off-road, and with the lower linear power, it's easy to control, making it really great for beginners. All of these bikes suck on the highway. Let's just get that out of the way immediately. But this was my least favorite in that regard. The combination of the cheaper feeling rattly chassis and the lack of power just makes for a pretty boring combination on the highway. In town and at low speeds, it's a fun, confidence-inspiring machine though. As you can probably tell, my biggest problem with this bike is really just the build quality. Although it's direct competition with the CRF250L, Everything on the 250L just feels higher quality and better thought out. Within a month or two of my friend owning the bike, the kickstand broke off where it's actually welded to the frame, and his automatic cam chain tensioner failed, and this wasn't even with 5,000 miles on the bike yet. I mean, don't get me wrong, this is obviously anecdotal, but it seems like a lot of people on forums are having similar issues with their KLX 250s. But that's not to say at all that this machine is just totally unreliable and just sucks. I mean, that's not what I'm trying to get at all. I'm just saying that it's quality-wise a step down from the Honda. The place where this bike really shines is its value. It easily beats the 250L off-road, and it's more affordable in the used market than all four of these bikes by a long shot. And the new ones have EFI too, so that's just an added bonus. And that's another thing. I mean, if you're looking at these bikes, um, the only two bikes that have carbs on them would be the DRZ400 and the KLX, the older KLX250s, I'm sorry. So that's definitely something to consider if you're maybe riding in a temperate climate or at very differing elevations. But honestly, I mean, carbs aren't all that bad anyways. I never had a single issue with the carb on my DRZ400. And just to add one more final thought on this bike, um, the suspension really isn't all that bad for a bike at this price point. It's definitely better than the CRF250L by a long shot, but you'll find out soon that that's not really saying much anyways. So next, we'll move on to the CRF250L. When my buddy Wyatt first offered to let me use this bike, I can't say I was exactly excited to be going from a DRZ400 to that, but I actually really, really enjoyed every time I threw my leg over this bike. This bike is the epitome of it's more fun to ride a slow bike fast than a fast bike slow. It's almost identical in weight to the DRZ 400 with a lot less power per se, but man, does this bike feel so much lighter than the DRZ. The motor sits much lower in the chassis than the DRZ, so I suspect that's probably the reason why it feels similar to the KLX in balance. Although it's not nearly as flickable as the KLX or WR, maybe due to the wider chassis. But probably the first thing I noticed about riding this bike is just how smooth it is. There's virtually no vibrations in the bars or the foot pegs at all when compared to, well, all of these bikes really. It just floats on the street, and that alone pretty much easily makes this one of the best street bikes on this list. Also, the maintenance intervals on this thing are just ridiculous. 8,000 mile oil changes? That's just absurd. Really, where this bike falls the furthest behind, though, would be the ergonomics, suspension, and its off-road capabilities, really. This bike is extremely cramped for a dual sport, especially being as tall as I am. I notice it much more immediately than other people. Where I can stand like okayishly on the KLX 250 and actually like decently well on the DRZ and WR, uh, I cannot comfortably stand on this bike at all. If you're shorter, you won't notice it as much, but this bike is definitely not made for taller people. Just to put that out there. Plain and simple, the suspension on this bike sucks. In this category, it's by far the worst out of all four of these bikes. My buddy even put heavier springs on the front, and the fork seals in it are fresh, but the valving on this bike is just way too soft for really even slighter off-roading. If you're considering this bike for hard off-road work, you're going to have to revalve and respring it for sure. Even if you're 100 pounds lighter than I am, it's still going to be not enough for you. The bike is balanced very well, but when you get into loose terrain, the bike really likes to wander more than the other three. I'm thinking that might have something to do with the suspension and just how it's valved and stuff, but really I just think that has something to do with more how the bike is balanced as well. So I really don't know exactly why it is the way it is, but we're going to move on to the last part I want to talk about this bike, and that'd be the power. It has more low-end power than the KLX250 and WR250, and more overall power than the KLX250, which definitely makes it more fun. But the WR250R is still in a league of its own when it comes to just outright power. It kind of just slaps both the CRF250 and the KLX250 in the face in that department. And I'll explain more on that when I get to that bike, but I think the CRF250 makes pretty decent power for what it is, and especially at its price point. I feel it has that going for it as well. But one thing you have to remember is that these bikes, none of them are dirt bikes or even comparable to dirt bikes when it comes to power. Uh, they're very, very low strung motors with very low maintenance with a lot of oil capacity. So these things are made to run for thousands of miles, where dirt bikes are made to run for hours before they require maintenance. So there's a big difference there. The DRZ400 is similar to like a WR250F or a CRF250F in terms of power, but I mean, obviously that bike can go 3,000 miles on an oil change. I just figured I'd get that out of the way right away because I know there are a lot of guys that buy these bikes with the expectations of them being similar to the dirt bikes that they're coming off of or something. Like these bikes have a lot of lights, emission equipment, bigger alternators, heavier cranks to smooth vibrations out and stuff. There's just a lot more that goes into these bikes to make them more reliable, dependable, and cheaper in general. So the materials aren't there either. But yeah, let's move on to the next bike. Whereas the KLX 250 and the CRF 250 are more in the market to compete with each other, and are, in my opinion, aimed at shorter and more beginner-oriented riders because of their much lower seat height and lower power. These next two bikes are more in a league of their own. There is some crossover between all four of them though, which is why I'm doing all of them in one video. I'll start off with the DRZ400. This bike has by far the most torque out of all of these bikes, and what's most important about that power is that the majority of the torque hits low in the rev range, just like a dirt bike. The WR closely competes to it horsepower wise, but all of its power is made way up high in the rev range, kind of just like a smaller two-stroke bike. It's also about the same weight as the 250L, making this bike the top pick out of these four if you're in it just for the power to weight ratio. The seating position is definitely more spacious vertically than the 250L and KLX, but it's still not as spacious as the WR. Also, the bars are really low on it, giving you the sensation that you're sitting on top of the bike rather than in it. For very tall riders, that's very easily fixed with some risers and taller bars, and I can tell you right now that the stock cables work to go at least 4 inches higher than stock height. In my opinion, the suspension is second best out of these four, with the rear shock being almost as good as the WR, but the front forks don't compare to the WRs in both bottoming resistance and dampening. Although the suspension is not the best, coupled with the higher ground clearance, it's better to the point of where this bike is much more off-road capable than the KLX and 250L. Really, the biggest flaw of this bike is how it carries its weight. It just feels top heavy, even though it's the same weight as the 250L. I don't know if that's because of the geometry or the center of gravity, but that's just how it feels to me. I'm sure that if I were more experienced, this wouldn't be an issue. Also, it's worth noting that the front end feels very light on this bike, which gives you a very awkward sensation when you're riding on the road. The second biggest flaw of this bike is the gearbox and how the gears are spaced apart. That, and being the fact that it's the most vibey out of these four bikes, makes this one of the worst on the highway, specifically at 60 to 65 miles per hour. That's assuming you have stock gearing. Just because your RPMs are really, really high in the rev range and the bike is just screaming at those speeds. The power, or I should say the low end torque of this bike, makes it the easiest to ride for a taller beginner. Because you don't need good clutch control with how much torque this bike has, you can just gas it and get out of pretty much any tight spot without using too much clutch. That, and just having lots of torque in general makes learning how to use a clutch very easy. The same thing also applies to cars and trucks. On the flip side, this is a bike where that power can also get you into trouble. I'll leave a quick video example of me whiskey throttling into a tree.
Oh! Ow! That really hurt. Oh no. Oh, I took down an entire tree.
This was back when I had very little clutch control, probably 3 to 4 years ago. This bike wheelies very easily. With stock gearing, I could pull 4th gear clutch ups, whereas I struggle to do 2nd gear clutch ups on my lower geared WR250R. So if you're looking to do wheelies on one of these bikes, buy the DRZ. Out of all 4 of these bikes, this bike has the biggest aftermarket by a long shot. Many people don't note this, but this bike has the hardest oil change process. 3 drain plugs, the frame, crankcase, oil filter drain plug. Then you have the actual oil filter and a screen that needs to be cleaned frequently on the frame oil drain. It's small and it's very nitpicky, but I figured I'd mention it anyways. Honestly, one of the worst things about this bike is the terrible BSR36 carb, but not for the reasons you're probably thinking. It's just not very fun to work with compared to other carbs, and if you tip the bike over, instead of just draining gas out of an overflow like a normal carb would do, it just floods the entire carb due to all the emissions crap in it. So every time you pick up your DRZ from a drop, you'll be cranking with wide open throttle just to get all that gas out of there, which I'll leave a video example of this as well.
I can see you. Yeah. Start. Come on.
Although this issue is easily sorted with Electron or an FCR carb. Honestly though, the absolute 2 best qualities of this bike are the build quality and simplicity of it. This thing is a tank, and it's super easy to work on. Aside from the clutch case and stator case, good luck breaking anything that's not easily replaceable on it. Now we'll move on to the final bike, and my personal favorite, the WR250R. By a long shot, this is the most comfortable bike for taller riders out of these 4. It has a very spacious cockpit, and the bars are up relatively high, making it pretty easy for even me to stand up in stock form. In this way, it's actually one of the best bikes I've ridden. Better than a lot of dirt bikes too, even KTM's. Its suspension is also best suited for handling heavier riders in stock form, and although it's only 20 to 25 pounds lighter than the DRZ, it feels more like it's 50 plus pounds lighter. Easily the lightest feeling bike out of these 4. This bike is the closest thing you'll get to a dirt bike in how it handles and feels compared to the other 4 also. It's very agile and flickable. Turning into a berm or corner off-road is just more precise, and you'll have much more confidence throwing this thing around than the other bikes. The power comes on like a 125 two-stroke bike. Starts with very little, then builds, 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 and then bam, you have almost 30 horsepower. It's not very good for beginner off-road riders because of the very little low-end torque that it has. This bike requires very good clutch control. It's not perfect though. The power and how it's made is something a lot of people will be disappointed and may grow out of quickly. But my first bike was an RM125, so I'm accustomed to this kind of power delivery and I prefer it. Also, if you don't like revving a bike out and wringing out its neck, which I understand completely if you don't, you're not going to be getting the most out of this bike and you won't like it at all. You need to consider getting something else if that's the case. This bike needs to be running at about 5,000 RPMs or above to get the most out of it. Trust me, it can handle it, and they're damn reliable doing it. It has the longest valve check intervals out of the 4, at almost 27,000 miles, which is just insane. And although the motor and just in general it's not as smooth as the 250L, when compared to the other 2, this bike is very, very, very smooth. Just like the 250L, this bike is ridiculous fun on road. Just ringing this bike's neck out on twisty hill roads is a blast. It's 60 to 65 miles an hour. Yes, it can easily do those speeds even with me, a 280-pound ogre on it. You're running fairly low RPMs and the vibrations are very little. This bike is very high quality. Everything you touch feels solid and all the plastics are very high quality. Not to mention, but everything is engineered very well and easy to access. Definitely best in class in that regard. Yamaha did an awesome job getting everything they could out of this machine in its stock form. They just don't benefit as much from aftermarket accessories like the other three. If you do that buy this bike, in my opinion, just keep it bone stock, except maybe suspension. Aftermarket parts will gain you only a few horsepower and you won't notice a difference at all, and trust me, I have experience with that. And unlike the issue with the DRZ where it just floods the carb out when you drop it, with fuel injection on this bike, if you drop it, you just pick it up and start it. No hassle. There's no cranking involved, it just starts. Same goes for the 250L and fuel injected KLXs as well. Although the carbed KLX did not have the same issue that my DRZ did, where the carb just floods out and takes forever to start it. One of the last things I want to talk about is the front forks on this bike. They are awesome and they are stout. They're very thick in diameter compared to the other bikes, and they also allow for the best upgrade path compared to the other three. The rear shock is only slightly better than the DRZ though. And one thing I do want to note is that I never noticed the rebound issue that a lot of people mention about the WR's rear shock. I don't know if that's because of my weight or whatever, but I think the rear shock on the WR is great, specifically for my style of riding. Don't get me wrong, I definitely need to respring it, but at my weight that's a given. And the valving itself is actually really decent for a bike of this price point and for what it's set up to do. And just as a final note, if you're afraid of fuel injection complicating a motorcycle or something like that, and maybe it failing in muddy, wet conditions, don't be. How they have these bikes engineered and what they did to, I guess, make them more reliable, it has really worked. And I find myself working on this fuel injected bike much less than I did my carbureted DRZ, specifically after like letting it sit for a winter, which is 5 to 6 months just in a garage doing nothing, which obviously these bikes are meant to be ridden year round. Otherwise, I mean, gas goes bad, gums up the carb, and that was the issue that I was having. Whereas with fuel injection, it doesn't really seem to matter at all if the gas is bad, it just starts and it goes. That's basically all there is to it. That concludes my individual thoughts on these bikes. Now, for the hell of it, I'm going to give my general subjective rankings on what I would buy personally. I rate myself as a 20% on-road, 80% off-road rider when I'm on my WR250R. And just remember, this is what I prefer. Some of you may need different things from your bikes or have different preferences. That's fine. I completely understand. But from least likely to buy to most likely, here's how they stand in my book. The KLX250S, like I said, it just wasn't really impressive to me in any particular way, but it is objectively good. DRZ400S, the power is awesome, but I never felt truly in control of the bike just because of how it was balanced. And honestly, I find my Africa Twin easier to handle in a lot of situations than my old DRZ. Of course, in the tight stuff, the DRZ is going to be easier, but this is just my opinion. And then the CRF250L, this bike is big fun for its price and size, and despite the KLX being objectively better, I still liked this bike more. And then my personal favorite, the WR250R, it's basically a much better version of the CRF250L, and it's the best off-road bike on this list. And now I'll make my on-road rankings and off-road rankings. On-road, from best to worst, this is how it would go for me. CRF250L, WR250R, DRZ400, and KLX250S, with the 250L being the best on-road. And then off-road, from best to worst, this is how I would rank them. WR250R, DRZ400, KLX250S, and CRF250L, with the WR being the best. Obviously this is subjective, but the small displacement bikes are just huge fun to me nowadays. Plus, I like the response I get when I tell people I ride a 250 at my size. Now, which bike is right for you? This is going to be very generalized, and like I said before, I'll try and hit as many use cases as possible, but you're welcome to comment below and ask me personally if I missed anything. Besides the 250L, I wouldn't consider buying any of these bikes new, especially if you're going to be off-roading them and dropping them. Look for used bikes in great shape. If you're a shorter, beginner rider with a really tight budget, you have no other option than the KLX 250S. If you're on an even tighter budget than that, maybe look for a KLR 250 because they're an even cheaper option yet. If you're a shorter beginner rider without a budget, get the 250L. If you want the most well-rounded bike on this list, WR250R or DRZ400. If you're taller, say 6'3" and above, and a beginner rider brand new to the just motorcycles in general, don't even bother with the 250L or KLX. Hell, don't even go with the WR. Expand your budget and get a DRZ. Otherwise, if you're on a tight budget, a KLX will work, but it won't be ideal. Just remember what I said, the WR250R is not a very good beginner off-road machine. You need quite a bit of good clutch control to make that bike work. If you have a lot of experience riding dirt already and don't require the power anymore, get a WR. If you have a lot of dirt riding experience already and require the power, get a DRZ. If you want to do harder enduro riding, don't buy any of these bikes. Buy a dirt bike or a KTM, or Husqvarna, Beta, whichever floats your boat. But if you do need one of these four, I wouldn't consider anything except the WR. If you want to stunt, get a DRZ or a WR, preferably the DRZ. All of these bikes could do it, but these two bikes will be best at it. If you're coming off a dirt bike and want to get into dual sporting and have high expectations in the power department, buy a DRZ. But realistically in that use case, you should be looking at a KTM or Husky, or some street legal option that's close to just the dirt bike experience in general. If you want the best road bike out of these four, get the 250L or 250R. Sure, the DRZ has more power, but that transmission sucks for anything over 55 miles an hour and it's very vibey. If you're going to be at 55 miles per hour and below and feel you need that power, just get the DRZ. It's great on road other than that. If you used to ride dirt bikes as a kid and are now well into your adolescent life and want a dual sport, get a DRZ or WR. If you're an intermediate dirt rider, maybe the DRZ or WR would be good for you. If you're looking for something to putt around on the road and just explore light trails, just buy the cheapest of any of these four bikes. If you're coming off a street bike and looking into dual sports, you'd be most at home with the seating of a 250L. It has the most street bike oriented seating and will be the easiest to get accustomed to in the dirt if you're coming off of a street bike. If you're a super tall fellow, like me for instance, just looking to get into a dual sport, preferably the WR250R. If not, the DRZ will be fine with much higher bars and higher seat, lower foot pegs. If you're 300 plus pounds, maybe just get a DRZ, although I promise you the WR will still handle your weight, even at 70 miles an hour if need be. I know there will be people and use cases that I missed, and I know this is extremely generalized, but if you have any questions, comment below, or, you're welcome to PM me as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time.